custody arrangements, house arrest, but in various possible settings, with GPS monitoring, placements. This is certain inmates that are evaluated as being lower risk. House arrest could include placement in a residence, a program, hospital, or treatment center. Inmates that would be eligible for this treatment would be those with less than 12 months to serve, also the medically infirm and elderly inmates that pose no great risk to society currently. We estimate that this will result in a population reduction of 6,300 in 2009-10 and savings of $120.5 million. This would be an ongoing program. However, because all of the other reductions that we've proposed, if they're all adopted, would eliminate our ability to get more savings with this option. We're not scoring anything yet in out years for this. To the extent that you don't take all of the things that we've proposed to reduce, you could get ongoing savings from this proposal.
Thank you. And I think the LAO has a different alternative to present.
Paul Goluszewski with the Legislative Analyst's Office. We would just recommend that if the legislature adopts this proposal, you could specify in statute which inmates would be eligible for alternative custody. The Department of Finance's proposal leaves that discretion up to the Secretary of the Department of Corrections. But, for example, you could specify in statute that eligibility would be limited to nonviolent, non-serious, non-sex offenders with less than 3 months to serve in prison, and also non-serious, nonviolent, non-sex offenders over the age of 55 as two examples. And we calculate the savings for those two groups at $150 million, which is $30 million greater than their proposal.
Great, thank you. I did want to mention, and I say something similar to this every day, and we don't quite do everything I intend to do during a day, but we do intend to try to get through the remaining agendas today, and that's 6 agendas, so it's pretty ambitious and aggressive schedule, but I am hoping we can stick to that. Okay, discussion on this item, members. The recommendation is to hold it open pending action on a comprehensive corrections cut package. Mr. Nielsen.
I would just suggest another part of the criteria should be that there would be not only the classification based on controlling case, but an examination of criminal history. If their behavior had been escalating or repetitious, that ramps everything up. I mean, all low-level offenders or all receiving stolen property guys are not the same. Okay, so as a matter of criteria, I think someone needs to, we need to account for that prior history and how they comported themselves on parole as another consideration for inclusion in the class. And also, I think if we're going to do such things as classes, it should always be some kind of verbiage into the effect that this is a revocable privilege. In other words, once you're in the class, you're not entitled to stay in the class forever. You can get out of the class, or you can be moved up into a higher level of security and custody or based on your comportment.
Thank you. Mr. Cheney.
I actually agree with most of what Mr. Nielsen just said. I mean, I think if we are going to define them, I mean, sort of the threshold question is, do we leave discretion, or do we at least lay out some parameters in the statute? Might not be a bad idea. I'm not quite sure how you get to more savings by doing that. It would seem to me discretion would get us more savings. And yours was 3 months. I think that's too low. You were 12 months? 6 seems more rational to me than either of those, but
well, they haven't.
3's too short.
Since theirs is up to the discretion of the Secretary, I think they just assumed 6,400. With our specific criteria, we got to 7,700 population reduction.
Explain to me how that works. But
part of our thinking is, as Mr. Nielsen mentioned, looking at using a risk-based methodology. So we would look at this category of inmates, but we would also be looking at a risk screen. And that's part of the rationale for having more flexibility for the Secretary, so that we could take more of a science-based, scalable approach.
Well, but we could set up the classes and then do the risk analysis within the classes, right? I mean, I think that's right. We do need a risk-based analysis. So Mr. Nielsen's right about how that works. And there should be classes, and certainly elderly, we need to define. Most of us here, I know 50 is the going age, but some of us are older than that. But that's the point. I don't know if it's 55 or 60 or whatever that age would be for. I mean, I know I had the bill a few years ago, and others have done similar legislation. And certainly the medically needy, if we can get them out in the community, they can get on Medi-Cal, Medicare. The feds can pick up half the medical costs. That's a big savings. So if we're going to define the classes and then have the risk-based within it, I would think we could design it so there's still some discretion to the department, but within this is who's eligible for consideration for this option. Does that make sense? I mean, yeah.
Mr. Leno?
For LAO, would you happen to have numbers with you, or might you be able to find for us how large the pool would be if we looked at, again, nonviolent, non-serious, non-sex offense, over 55 but with 12 months, over 60 with 12 months, the idea being that if we've got a group of very low risk, again, looking at both a risk-based analysis, but also if we were to put into statute that over a certain age, the idea being that we know that the likelihood of reoffending goes down dramatically over a certain age, as well as the costs of incarceration going up exponentially at a certain age. Those are the very most expensive folks that we have. If we could get them out of the system into a GPS scheme, what additional savings might we have? Could we get up another $100 million?
On the issue of the inmate population over 55, there's about 11,000 offenders over the age of 55 in prison, but...
And how many of those would be the nonviolent, non-serious, non-sex?
Probably not that many, because a lot of them are going to be lifers, three strikers. So we had estimated maybe 500 would be non-serious, non-violent, non-sex.
So that pool gets smaller and smaller as the age goes up?
Yeah.
Mr. Nielsen, did you have a follow-up?
Yes. Many years ago, I worked with Assemblyman Villagrosa on some legislation related to what we called not compassionate but medical release. 1170E is that section. Now that's applicable to the most seriously infirm that would not be under certain circumstances a risk to the public. That language was carefully drafted to ensure that these were people that would not be a risk of danger, and I would like to work with you on some of that verbiage. We're talking about a broader class than was applied in that bill. Senator Cheney's been involved in this issue over the years. I know Assemblywoman Rosenthal has some interest in this too. And the point is there are a lot that probably could be safely released. We have to be cognizant, though, and a plan have to be provided under the 1170E section, because there is an impact on the community. The individuals require some kind of care, and the question is where will that care and how will it be provided? And we have to be careful we just don't create a problem for local counties or something like that by virtue of what we do here. So the language has to be carefully crafted, and I would appreciate the opportunity to work on whatever language we may be considering.
Great. So it sounds like we have a general consensus on this item to move forward at least, and it is to be held open pending action on a comprehensive package. Next item is page 12, program funding, elimination, and other operational savings for $787 million. Finance, could you start out and please address my concern that nearly half of the savings that is listed here is unallocated, so we don't really know where that's coming from.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We have received more information from the department as to the kinds of things they're looking at for the $300 million, so I can give you some of the main things they're looking at. But I'd have to start by saying that as we've looked at this and looked at our other reduction proposals, CDCR does not have a lot of options to achieve $300 million more. The one way that we know of that they could do it would be suspension of the DILS Act and a unilateral change to collective bargaining contract to make a 12-hour workday the standard in the prisons. If that's not adopted or acceptable to you, some of the other things that they're looking at are an additional 5% reduction to headquarters beyond what was already identified in the $400 million veto plan. That would be another $15 million. The department's also looking at workload in DJJ institutions, giving their population reductions, and trying to identify savings there that they could capture in 2009-10. They're also examining workload needs for mental health and dental staff in the institutions and may propose to modify the classifications used for certain duties. So if you could use lower level classifications, you could get some savings there. Those are some examples of things that they're looking at right now. They haven't made decisions or gone beyond just trying to identify where they can achieve more savings beyond the $1.5 billion we're already taking in 9-10.
Okay, I think we're all aware we have to make these decisions on Monday, so. Mr. Cheney, did you have?
Well, I mean, you know, whatever it is you can get out of headquarters, you should take it. Additional 5, additional 10. How many people you got over there now? How many vacancies?
I can tell you about the vacancy data. The last number we heard was not excessive. It's somewhere between 5 and 10%, so pretty close to the norm
to the salary savings. Yeah.
Right.
Well, I mean, but headquarters has grown to, I'm afraid to ask how many positions.
And we are proposing a $15 million reduction to headquarters as part of the parole reform package, and we're looking at an additional $15 million here. Some of the other reductions that we're looking at that are reductions that would require us to go back to the federal court and look at some additional flexibility, so that we're going as far as we can on headquarters reductions as well as reductions to program and to other areas like DJJ, but we have to work with the courts in order to achieve some of those.
Well, and the other piece of that, though, is administration even at the prison sites. I mean, it's the headquarters and the baseline administration and non-custodial positions, if you will, at the prisons. I mean, that piece has to be part of this because it's just way out there. And on the other issue, I mean, frankly, if y'all could figure out how to do a contract, since it's been 2 or 3 years since you had one, you might be able to do 10-4s and such things, but you got to kind of like sit at a bargaining table to do that. And imposing it and repealing the Dills Act is just, that's not, I don't think that's viable. I think you either need to get serious about your contract negotiations, which have now been, what, 3 years since they've had a contract? I mean, you can't keep doing that and then keep coming back trying to get around it. You're going to have to figure out how to do that. Is this the appropriate place to also talk about this list of things that you want to get rid of? The contracts and or is that a different item?
It's the basic.
The proposed reductions to programs, both
the programs,
contracts and it's
in
all
this
part
item.
of this proposal, yes.
Well, look, here's my take on that, and I don't know, maybe Mr. Nielsen or somebody else can help with this, but my sense of how we need to cut this one is a little bit, you have to do risk and needs assessment. You're going to have to use a compass, especially to make all these programs work. I'm less inclined to want to get rid of the adult education, voc education, aftercare treatment, the things that are, especially those that involve our employees versus the contract stuff. I'm more inclined to get rid of the contracts as a whole. And a couple of them I think we can fund in other ways. I think we can do post-parole employment and prison to employment with Workforce Investment Act funds. Governor's discretionary money, we used it that way last year. There's no reason not to use Workforce Investment Act money for the parole employment services, and possibly even for some of the other vocational or some of the kinds of programs that have been successful, like the ones at Folsom and stuff, where you're actually training people to do work. And we ought to be a little more creative. We got more federal funds there. We've got extra opportunity right now to use those funds for those kinds of purposes and get rid of the existing contracts, or at least to the extent they're good contracts, fund them with those resources, and try to keep some of the baseline education facilities who are actual employees, not contracts, in the where they belong. So that's.
Mr. Leno, then Mr. Dutton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Colleagues, I don't know if everyone has the list of the rehabilitation programs that make up the vast majority of the $787 million. I think it's valuable to have a close look at it, because otherwise you just sort of get glazed by the enormity of this near billion-dollar figure. But this really would dismantle rehabilitation altogether. And I would be adamant that if we went in this direction, and I don't suggest that we are going to, that we would have to take the name off of the department, the R off of the department name, because it would no longer be corrections and rehabilitation. The proposal is to cut $25 million from parole service centers. One of the largest line items is a $70 million cut in reducing recidivism strategies. This is just a formula for increasing our sky-high and nation's highest recidivism rate. Can I ask, if we're now close to 70% recidivism, have you projected, if we were to make these cuts, what we expect recidivism to be in 5 years? 75, 80, or 85? Because it's going to go up. It's not going to go down.
Similar to, we have not built into the number, we had not in the past built into the number a reduction in population associated with the expansion of rehabilitation programs. Similarly, we have not built any increases in population associated with the reductions.
Okay. I know that we're working on some other alternatives so that we can meet the goal of the 1.1, 1.2, hopefully even 1.3. But I think this is really a perfect formula to see the recidivism rate go up. One of the reasons we're in the situation we're in is because we have only in name suggested that we have rehabilitation for, and I'm sorry Mr. Nielsen's not in the room right now because he's done so much important work on this issue, that it's been decades in the making. This recidivism rate didn't hit 70% overnight. It's been many, many years because we have pretended that we've been investing in rehabilitation when we have not. And with 70% coming out functionally illiterate, with a drug or alcohol problem, virtually unemployable, what do we expect? They're going to come back in. And if we're going to make any serious impact in lowering the prison population, which we all know we need to do, and keep our communities safer all at the same time, and that's some of the other work that Senator Ducheney and I have been working on along with Senator Benoit this year, this is exactly the wrong direction to go.
Mr. Dutton.
Yeah, I was kind of curious about when we're talking about headquarter positions and so forth. Is it possible to determine, well, it should be possible, how many, what's the staffing within Department of Corrections that have no contact with, with inmates? Any idea?
We don't have a number broken down in that way.
Is it possible to get that kind of a number so I know what the ratio is between?
We could try to get some kind
more
of estimate,
administrative
yes.
than the other.
Sure.
Also, some of the specifics that were talked about, I don't see much. I don't see too many specifics here, and I was just wondering: is there another list of specific cuts or things, or that you're considering that I could take a look at? I haven't seen the specifics, so. And then on the, everybody talks about recidivism rates. I know 70% seems to be a number that's thrown around, but I haven't, is there actually some studies out there that has broken down as to what's happening? Because it would seem to me high unemployment also would create probably a cause and effect situation that would result in higher reentry too. Is there any studies out there so that I know what we actually are dealing with?
I'm sure that there are. We can see what we can come up with that's recent and that might have something like that for you.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Cheney. Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry. I had Mr. Blumenfield first, then Mr. Cheney.
Senator, on that point, right now we're not seeing a substantial population increase, even during a time of a very difficult economy.
trying to get a sense of how if we actually eliminate all rehabilitation, how will we stack up against other states? So how many other states have given up that responsibility for trying to rehabilitate prisoners?
Generally, this goes further beyond where other states are in terms of the reductions that they've made to rehabilitation. And we have generally made it a priority to build up these programs. That said, in this general fund situation, we think a reduction of this magnitude is required.
Yeah, it's a very sad statement if what comes out of all of this is that California becomes the state, the only state in the union that doesn't try to rehabilitate its prisoners. It just gives up. That's all.
Mr. Cheney.
Just one thought on this as you're drafting whatever you're doing, and we try to, I mean, you know, obviously we want to keep it away from the services as much as possible, but one thought on that laundry list that Senator Dutton's looking at right now, beyond my argument to keep the employee education folks there so that at least you can get people GEDs and such, and those vocational programs that we know are effective, like the one at Folsom with the apprenticeship program with the construction trades, is to block grant them in some way. That list looks like a categorical schools program to me. I mean, it's in some ways we might be able to take a few of them that we think are worthwhile, and some we just don't do those contracts because most of them are contract, but a few, and just put them in some sort of block grant that says, here's this money, go do whichever services work best in a given place. And I wouldn't put all of them, but I think of it as categorical reform at this point.
Mr. Nielsen, I know that you wanted to comment on this item.
Well, there certainly is some room here to do a little prioritization in the programs. There is a very significant redundancy in the programs in the institution. I would argue we shouldn't just eliminate them all, that they have an institutional security purpose, they have a hope purpose, they have an opportunity for individuals to improve themselves, which is very important. But I think that we could reach a fairly significant reduction here, at least for a short period of time, and not be too disruptive. But I would concur with what I did here, Senator Cheney, before I had to run to appropriations, that we would need to sit down and kind of go over the list and really have some heart-to-heart talk about it, and with some real candor from CDCR about what these programs are and what they individually do. I remember when the new parole model was rolled out as some great, wonderful new thing which succeeded the preventive parolee failure program. Unfortunately, it was nothing but the same old with a big new title on top of it. And we can't be doing that anymore. It's time to really reckon with some things. Let's decide what were the very best, most essential to serve the greatest number of inmate populations for rehabilitative opportunities, as well as parolees services. And let's focus on those for now. And some of the other things we just have to put on hold for a short time. But I'd like to look at a list and work with people on a list.
Excellent comments.
Madam Chair?
Yes, I was just about to call on you.
Just to address that point.
You have some alternatives for us to look at?
Right. We looked at the list of programs, and it's difficult to prioritize, as Assembly Member Nielsen was suggesting, just because CDCR doesn't have data that's tied to the particular programs to say this program's more effective than that program. We do have... There is sort of data from national studies on programs that will say these programs, you know, substance abuse might reduce recidivism by X amount, education by X amount, but it's difficult to apply that to CDCR because we don't know if they're following the best practices and implementing the programs correctly without data specific to their programs. So the approach that we took, because we do think that preserving some of the programs is important for reducing recidivism, but since we couldn't prioritize due to the lack of data, what we're suggesting is that you reduce funding for rehabilitation programs in proportion to the reduction in the inmate and parole population that would result from all of the other proposals. And that would result in a reduction of $111 million in rehabilitation funding in 2009-10, as opposed to the elimination, which would be $455 million.
Okay, good. This item is supposed to be held open pending action again on the Comprehensive Corrections Cut Package, but excellent debate, and I think you've heard what the members think about how we might do this. Page 13, Adult and Juvenile Population Adjustment. may revise scores 28.5 million in savings, and my understanding that this is an adjustment to reflect reduction in population. Okay. The LAO, do you have an alternative here for us to look at?
The population adjustment, it's really sort of an aggregate figure. There's a lot of different components to it, and this is the net reduction. We do have an issue with one particular part of the population adjustment. The department is requesting an augmentation of $9.4 million for increased costs associated with the overflow from administrative segregation units. Administrative segregation is special units where they hold inmates who they suspect of having a disciplinary infraction. And they say that this population has increased and therefore they need more funding for this purpose. But we would note that the Inspector General recently found that the department was not effectively managing its administrative segregation population, which had led people to be held in ADSEG units for too long. So we think with better management practices, they really wouldn't need this $9.4 million augmentation. So we would recommend decreasing the funding from the negative 28.6 to negative 38.
Thank you. Members, we also have a staff recommendation to do something differently and actually have an increased reduction of $52.6 million. That would include the following components: reject $9.4 million for administrative segregation overtime, reject $6.4 million for increase in the daily jail rate, and reject $8.4 million for parole revocation hearings. And this item really is ready for action if the committee
Would repeat that list again, please,
Sure.
Madam Chair?
Reject $9.4 million for administrative segregation overtime, reject $6.4 million for increase in the daily jail rate, and reject $8.4 million for parole revocation hearings, for a total of $52.6 million in savings. And we have a motion from Mr. Cheney to adopt
Madam Chair,
that.
can I clarify? The parole revocation hearings, Mr. Nielsen, is because of the reduction in parole population that's
Yeah.
assumed from the other.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah, let's hear from the Department of Finance. Go ahead.
Madam Chair, our savings estimates did take into account the reduction of in this workload that would result from our reduction. So if you took all of our reductions, you couldn't also take this one.
I understand. It's either or. And we like the higher number.
Our concern with the 8.4 is that it's a double count based on the adjustments that we made in the parole package, and the concern is that this is court-required workload associated with Valdivia.
Right.
Well, that's what question I had would be the 12.6 million that was Senate staff. Was that's for you're saying we don't need those attorneys? We have to have them under the court right now. That is in litigation, by the way, but the court did stay the provision of Marsy's law that eliminated that requirement. So for the time being, we still have to provide attorneys.
We believe we need these additional resources in order to be in compliance with the court requirements.
I would say the attorneys you would. But in terms of the reduction in the parolee population, that is a reasonable and justified reduction, is it not?
But we are capturing savings in the parole reform package associated with the reduction in our parolee population. So our concern is if you score it in both places, it's a double count, and it would put our level of resources below what we would need to meet the Valdivia requirements for the population that would remain.
I understand, but we're not to the parole reform side yet. That hasn't been accepted, okay? It may be, but it may not be. There's probably going to be some opposition to that package.
Madam Chair,
Yeah,
if I can go.
I was going to
For
explain why you think that's not a double count.
Well, for the Valdivia workload, the way that they projected was based on the number of revocation hearings, which they were projecting to increase, which is why there's an augmentation for that. However, I think the staff comment is looking at the overall parolee population is going down. So if you look at that, you wouldn't really expect revocation hearings to increase.
And this is not a cut, then. This is just a cut to the augmentation. This is not doing an augmentation as opposed to not doing base. If you worked whatever you work into your base, you don't need an augmentation.
No, this adjustment would fund them at their current operating level. So If you lower it, then they would then not have enough funding in their budget to meet the workload requirements right now.
It's based on the premise, though, that revocation hearings will increase, which doesn't
But
seem...
part of the issue is you can have more hearings regardless of whether or not the parole pop goes up or down. It really depends upon, the number of arrests and parole holds that get conducted out in the field. And the number of holds are actually up significantly.
One other point is that although overall we are projecting a decrease in parole population, the big factor that makes it go from an increase to a decrease is just the removal of 10,000 deported aliens that were carried on a reduced caseload, 1,200 to 1 caseload. Those are being removed in our projection, but if you take that out of the equation, which only requires 7 or 17 staff or something like that, very small, then we actually will have an increase in parolees according to our projections.
That is correct. We show an increase from fall to the spring in the number of felon parolees on parole by almost 2,000 ADP.
Okay, thank you. Members, we do have a motion. I'm seeing heads nodding on the Senate side. Do I have 5-0 on the Senate side? The motion is to adopt the staff recommendation. $52.6 million. Okay, we've got 5 ayes on the Senate side and 5 ayes on the Assembly side. Mr. Nielsen?
Yeah, I would just qualify that there's a lot more work to be done here. In terms of this particular item, though, I am in sympathy with proceeding, so it would be 5-0. Assemblyman Neal would agree.
Thank you. Moving on to page 14, there's 2 items here: technical adjustment to reducing recidivism strategies funding, and then adult population adjustment. Okay, that action apparently conforms. All right, the first item is the technical adjustment to reducing recidivism strategies funding, and that has a 0 in the column of the May revise. And then the next one is adult population adjustment inmate welfare fund for savings of $591,000. Excuse me, I'm trying to add zeros, wish I could, which is a conforming issue to the item, to the action we just took. So the first item, though, technical adjustment to reducing recidivism strategies funding. My understanding is there actually is some savings in there, and perhaps that's an LAO alternative, or?
Yes.
It's actually a proposal by the administration. But
okay.
There's a category of programs that are lumped together under this reducing recidivism strategies that we were talking about earlier. And what the administration is proposing to do is take savings from certain programs and shift them to other programs.
Okay.
We think that this proposal would...
So it's a fund shift.
So it's a net zero, shifting from one program to another. But we think that whatever action on this proposal depends on what you're going to do with the rehabilitation cuts, so we would probably recommend holding open to...
No. The recommendation is to accept the reduction here by $8.1 million.
I think we may have to leave it open till we solve the problem of which of the program cuts we make. Isn't that the... That's what I just heard.
That's what we were suggesting.
That's what I just heard.
I don't know.
And, Madam Chair, my understanding is that the proposal is really a realignment to reflect the scoring in the right place relative to where it's been spent. So I have concerns that by sweeping dollars that have been spent in a slightly different place, that we'd be leaving the department with a hole.
So are you suggesting that this item should be held open, or we should accept the adjustment?
Madam Chair, Justin Howard, Department of Finance. There's really 2 issues here what I think is going on. One was there was an augmentation to the department for $8.1 million to expand the reducing recidivism strategies. That scoring has been accounted for in the administration's program reduction proposal. So if you hold that open, because you have to reconcile, you can only score it in one spot. However, the BCP in question that everybody else was referring to actually is just a technical adjustment that aligns the budget to where the program dollars are actually being spent. Last year, the department submitted a request through the JLBC and got approval to realign their recidivism reduction strategies funding, and unfortunately, we didn't make the appropriate budget adjustments to reflect the funding in the correct program. This is merely fixing that issue.
Okay, so we should hold it open then to conform with other actions. All right, let's move on to page 15. Department, Coleman versus Schwarzenegger CMF mental health crisis bed facility staffing for an additional increased cost of $4.59 million. Department of Finance, would you like to start us off on this? I know there's this one and the next item as well relate both to Coleman v. Schwarzenegger.
And we also spoke about some items of the Department of Mental Health, and these are a series of small projects that are part of addressing the concerns of the Coleman Court relative to access to mental health services for inmates. So this is one of the projects that we believe we need to move forward with, given the court actions and upcoming court order.
LAO, did you have a comment?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Aaron Edwards, LAO. The requests here are in line with the mental health workload staffing that serves as the basis to determine what number of positions should be used to staff these mental health crisis beds. However, we would note that there are at this time about 800 vacant positions in other mental health, in the mental health area. And we're looking into the possibility of redirecting some possible salary savings from those vacant positions to possibly fund these on a temporary basis.
So if that were the case, would we see these numbers go down then as far as the costs? Is that a cost savings or is it just a shift?
It would be shifting the savings from those other areas to fund these positions.
Okay. It's just so frustrating to look at $8 million in a combined 70 beds during this economic time when we're talking about cutting these other programs so substantially. But we have to do it because of court order. So is there any discussion, comment? If not, I think we can move to approve both the item on page 15 and 16.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Just a quick question.
Mr. De Leon.
I just want to echo your comments. I find it rather obscene that we're going to dish out $8 million for these 70 beds. I know this is because it's a lawsuit, and I understand that. I'm not a lawyer, so let me ask this question. Obviously, this is a court order by the judge. Given the magnitude of the budget crisis, that's unprecedented, and because of the severity of the cuts to so many programs across the board, what happens or what could happen if we didn't move forward with this action?
Generally, as we've talked a little bit about the Coleman Court, this is a case that's been going on since the 90s. And what would happen if we are out of compliance with the court order is that we would be at risk of contempt. And that would be for CDCR, Department of Finance, and all of us involved in the litigation.
And we could be in contempt. Or we would be in contempt.
Would likely be in contempt. We'd be in violation of a court order, so we'd likely be in contempt.
Is there, what happens there then? Is there an appeal process? See, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know this stuff, so educate me on this one.
I mean, generally, the risk if the issue is not addressed is that we could face, jail time for being out of compliance with a court order.
Me or you or who? You. You? Okay.
We would promise to visit you, Anna.
Mr. De Leon, there is an appeal process, but we would likely not prevail. It would cost us more money in the long run, really. It's just one of those ironies and one of those frustrations of governance through federal court order. It's just, it can't and does not take into account so many other variable factors. And I do have to note the irony of building 20 beds at San Quentin when the governor wants to sell San Quentin. So there's a lot of frustration and irony, I think, involved in this, but it is something that I think we have to do as little as we like it. I know Mr. Leno had a comment, and then Mr. Cheney.
Thank you. If you could help us better understand what we're talking about here, aside from the potentiality of court order and contempt and such. Put a human face on this. We're talking about severely mentally ill prisoners, and tell us what the court deemed we were not doing and deemed what we must do.
Sure. Amy Jarvis, Department of Finance. Basically, we just weren't providing the level of care to these inmates. In fact, with these mental health crisis beds, there still is an identified shortage of mental health crisis beds. These are supposed to be beds where inmates are in them for 10 days during crisis care, mostly on suicide watch. Right now, we're running them about 14 to 18 days on average. The court is directing us to construct more beds because we're using other type housing to house these crisis patients on a short-term basis. So that's why the court actually ordered the construction of the beds and then expects us to fill them.
Does this, when you talk about their care, are we also talking about medication they should be getting that they're not getting?
In some cases,
Potentially not
potentially in that
Right.
case. And in this case, they are highly medicated once they're in a crisis bed.
Right. And in a more perfect world, we may have been providing these mentally ill individuals some medical care rather than having them in the community where they were causing trouble to themselves and others and finally making their way into our criminal justice system when they should have been in a mental health system to begin with. So it's an ugly situation, but yeah, thank you.
Unfortunate. Yes.
Mr. Cheney.
I don't know if tell me how this goes with page 108 in our health agenda on mental health. In our mental health agenda, administration asked for a $25 million augmentation on Coleman that we left open, and I'm not quite sure how this Coleman issue goes with that Coleman issue because they're both mental health beds, and I don't want to spend both.
Oh, I'm sorry. The difference is mental health crisis beds. The DMH proposal addresses our acute term in intermediate care.
What's the difference between acute and crisis?
Acute is a 90-day program, typically. Intermediate care is about 9 months. Our crisis beds are only intended to be a 10-day.
So is this proposal part of the plan that the court isn't going to hear till next week?
This actually is the mental health is associated with the plan that the court has not yet acted on. This is staffing for ordered facilities. So there's
previously ordered, not part of any plan. I mean, there's a frustration in this universe. I'm sorry, Plata, Coleman, all of it. There's never been a plan that made any sense. And if you're gonna do the receiver stuff and the health beds, somehow we got to get this coordinated so we know that we're doing, we're maximizing our ability to build mental health beds and dental beds with health beds. We've been through that discussion before with the receiver. Now we've got the new receiver proposal that could minimize, lower those previously proposed costs. And I'm still not seeing some coordination between all of these. And we get them all as separate items, and then it's more and more and more and more and more without any sense that anybody's rationalizing the resources.
Mr. Nielsen and then Ms. Walters.
There's something that's dangling here, though. Analysts brought up the personnel years, the vacancies. Can those, were you suggesting those can be redirected to staff these positions so we'll have less costs? Is that what I heard you say?
Yes. I mean, eventually, all of these positions will have to be filled to be in compliance with the court order. However, what we're saying is if they can't be filled, if the department knows they can't be filled on a temporary basis, then why not redirect some of those savings, at least for the current year, to fund these new beds that they're proposing?
Well, it's part of the issue I raised the other day, the salary savings game. So it would seem to me that we could take a hard action on this right now. That does accommodate this immediate need in terms of staff, does it not?
And these positions, my understanding is they are filled. We're relying on registry staffing for a portion of it. So we think we've accounted for salary saving, for vacancy rates in our dollars, and that these resources are for filled positions.
So your salary savings are going to go down then?
Well,
you're going to lose those. You will have filled those positions, so those salary saving positions will not be extant. Is that correct?
We still have the broader salary savings that the department is managing to because of the positions that the department has that it does not have dollars to fund. So there's the broader salary savings, but relative to this item, we think we've accounted for vacancies in our proposed funding level.
Okay, I get that, but please, analysts in finance, help us at some point over the macro issue of salary savings within the department. I think that's a huge issue. And I'd like to see us deal with it in the next few days, because I think there's some substantial dollars here in this salary savings PY stuff.
Can I add just one quick comment on that, just in terms of the mental health program? Any salary savings that they do have, they use to backfill with the use of registry staff, where they contract with mental health clinicians and nurses to provide the level of care that the court is expecting. So that's one piece of it. Do we know that it's exactly the salary savings and the use of registry are aligned? We don't know that. But on these mental health crisis beds at CMF, these positions actually are already in place. It's basically a continuation of them in 9-10. They were established in 7-8, continued in 8-9. They were established by you on a 2-year limited term basis in recognition that we had to come back with a full workload study because it's the only facility of its type within corrections. It's a standalone mental health crisis bed facility. So there is a little bit different scenario happening here with the mental health crisis beds at CMF. The beds at San Quentin are new beds that are proposed to come online January 2010.
Mr. Cheney.
The only thing, I heard that word registry. Registry nurses in the real world cost more than salaried employees. So how much of that are we doing?
A lot, unfortunately.
And why is that?
Because these are really hard to fill positions. So we've and there's been a series of court orders that have adjusted the pay, and we've increased the extent to which we're hiring and filling positions. But both in the Department of Mental Health and the Department of Corrections, these generally tend to be hard to fill positions. We undergo extensive efforts to try to fill as many of them as possible, but when we don't have them at the level, then our only other option is to use registry nurses in order to provide the services that our court required.
Well, keep trying. We should fill his vacancies and move people around. But I mean, reluctantly, I would move approval of the 308 and 309. They're both the same.
Okay, members, we have a motion to approve. On the Senate side, 4 in favor. On the Assembly side, 5 in favor. And we can move on to page 17. 2 items on this page. First one, Population Adjustment, Division of Juvenile Justice, Proposition 98, and then the second one, Adult Population Adjustment, Local Assistance Adjustment. Both of these are conforming items. Did Elio have a comment?
Oh, just a note that you skipped over the item on page 16, which is also a conforming item at the bottom.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. On page 16, Adult Population Adjustment, Inmate Health Care, another conforming item. So those 3 being conforming, we can move on to page 18. This is the San Quentin State Prison Condemned Inmate Complex. I think perhaps Department of Finance should lead us off, and then we can go to the LAO and then to Mr. Leno.
Chris Leaf, Department of Finance. This is an assembly proposal for a trailer bill language on the San Quentin Condemned Inmate Complex. We don't support this language. As you know, the governor has proposed selling San Quentin, and we believe the issue of the fate of this complex is properly determined along with the sale of the San Quentin property.
Okay, did the LAO have a comment on this?
Nancy Paulus, LAO. I'll explain what the budget bill language is. The budget bill language that was proposed in the Assembly would require the resolution of, number 1, the constitutionality of double selling of death row inmates, and number 2, the possible federal court-ordered early release of inmates before the department can encumber additional funds. So that, there are a couple issues out there that needed resolution before they move forward. We're unclear, in addition to some of these issues, we're unclear as to how the administration's proposal to sell San Quentin would impact the CIC project at San Quentin right now. So I think there are a number of issues sort of circling San Quentin.
Including the one we just adopted. Okay, Mr. Leno, I know you have some issues on this, and this was an issue that came through the Assembly subcommittee, but would you like to make some comments?
I do want to ask the LAO some questions about any number of recommendations they've given to us over recent years with regard to the rebuilding of the death row at San Quentin. But I just wanted to go back first to the Department of Finance. Did I hear you correctly that you disapprove of the budget bill language that came out of the Assembly because the governor wishes to sell San Quentin? You want to proceed with a $300 million plus project?
We believe the language is unnecessary. The project is fully designed and ready to go. The administration would not proceed with the project until the issue of whether to sell the property is settled.
But wouldn't it be consistent, since he's the one proactively pushing forward the sale, that he might put on hold a $300 million rebuild at the very site that he wants to sell?
I think that's what I said. The project would be on hold as the issue of selling the property is being
But I would think that as the one who's suggesting the sale, that same entity, the governor, might put on hold himself a $300 million project.
And we agree with that. We just don't think that the language is necessary. We are putting the project on hold until there's a final determination by the legislature on the sale of San Quentin. When there's that final determination occurs, then we either move forward with the project or we don't. We don't think that this language is necessary in order to accomplish that goal.
Okay. I'm in support of the language, and I just wanted to go back to the LAO, if I could, please, because one of the many criticisms you've had of this project, and I would actually ask if you could share with the committee what your concerns have been, why you have determined that this rebuild, which is likely necessary, but not at that site, that it could be done for significantly less money, dollars other places, but also specific to this language, your concern that if we were to proceed with, is it what, $330 million at this point?
$356,275,000.
Okay. Could you give us the history, the size of the project, the number of beds, what the cost was, that it's now been reduced significantly, though the costs have been raised exponentially, and your concern with the double bunking issue?
This project was originally approved for $220 million for 1,024 cells back in 2003.
I'm sorry, 1,000?
1,024 cells back in 2003-4.
And it's now up to 330.
Right, for $220 million, and you got over 1,000 cells.
So now we're up. The cost has gone up by 30%.
The cost has gone up significantly, but you have to realize that now they're only going to build 768 cells.
So the cost has gone up by 30%. The number of beds has dropped by 30%.
Right.
Okay.
So basically, the cost has gone up significantly, and there's really more to this when you begin looking at some of the cost issues. And these cost issues are not unique to San Quentin. They are unique to the entire prison construction program right now, where there's very, very significant increases in cost.
Okay.
But this particular situation is reflective of those also.
Okay. So again, just to reiterate, over the length of this project, the cost has gone up by a third. The number of beds that we would get for that has gone down by a third. The cost per bed now is over $500,000 per bed. It would be the most expensive bed anywhere in the country.
Right.
But to get to the point of the budget bill language, your point has been that the plan is for these 700 beds is to double bunk, and that by double bunking, which is done, I think, in only one state in the country, Oklahoma, that we want, before any further monies can be encumbered, to have the resolution of the question of the constitutionality of double bunking resolved before we go forward with any more expenditure. It would seem a wise thing to do, and that's all that's in this language.
The BSA did an audit of the San Quentin Condemned Inmate Complex last summer, and in their audit, they went ahead and pointed out exactly what you're pointing out, Senator Leno. They went ahead and surveyed 50 different states to find out how many people double-celled condemned row inmates, and only 12 states responded. And of those 12 states, Oklahoma stated that it currently double-celled around 80% of the condemned inmates.
And
so
that has never been challenged in Oklahoma.
I don't know whether it has or not. In their audit, they addressed this issue because they this is how they really started with this particular issue and addressed it. They said the United States Supreme Court has ruled that placing 2 inmates per cell in a relatively modern prison facility does not violate the constitutional prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. However, some experts we spoke to raised concerns about double celling condemned inmates. So that issue has not been resolved. And there may be people that will bring up constitutional issues related to that in this state. I don't know.
So it would just seem, colleagues, that given the nature of this project, the extraordinary expense of it, and the unresolved question of the constitutionality of the double bunking, that we would want to get some resolution to that before we put any more money into a project we've already invested in and could cost us hundreds of millions more. So,
down a little bit further in this audit, it says, additionally, the Chief Public Defender cannot say at this point whether his office would challenge the legality of double selling. In his professional opinion, a legal challenge would certainly be brought to such a plan by others who have standing to do so. So that is.
And just getting back then to finance, isn't this not a rational path to take? That if we are going to rebuild this and spend all these extraordinary dollars on it, that we want to make sure that, because this is the point, if the double bunking is found to be unconstitutional, we would be at capacity again in just a couple of years, and we would have spent over $330 million to find ourselves in a very similar position where we are now. So I think it's an important point, and that's why the Assembly put this language in.
I believe this point was debated last year as well, and the legislature decided to provide increased funding so the project could move forward.
I believe the conference committee and finally the legislature withdrew this money from the budget. The governor put it back in. Or it was through the negotiation when it got back to Big Five that it went.
The Budget Act of 2008 included funding for the project.
But the conference committee did not accept it. Okay. So I would move forward the budget bill language. I think it makes sense. We would want to get this question resolved before we allow any more money to be spent.
We have a motion, and we have 3 members wishing to speak so far, Mr. Lowenthal, Blumenfield, and Dutton.
You know, again, this may reflect a really lack of understanding, but someone who's really been very closely involved with all the infrastructure spending in the state in the past year or two have seen if we can get money bids out that really contractors out there and others have really reduced their prices significantly just to get work. Why are we reducing by 30% the number of inmates that can be housed, and the cost has gone up by 30% or so? Why is that so? At a time when we're finding people will bid on projects at a much lower rate than ever.
Well, the difference, there's a time. Again, I have real issues about costs, quite frankly.
So do I. I'm listening to
major issues about it. But the reason from 2002 to last year, when this was passed again in 2000 for the 2008-9 budget, you are looking at a time frame. You are looking at a difference in time. But that difference in time, there are a number of components that potentially can contribute to cost there. But again, I had overall concerns when I looked at this project and I looked at AB 900 last year. I saw at the time a tripling of cost on AB 900. Now I've seen a quadrupling of cost from 2002 till 2009. And so this project has not changed in terms of cost at this point in time. Although the person who did this, who was involved with this particular audit, sees that this $356 million, and this is what we've approved, and this may be exactly what it costs, but he suggested that the number would be closer to $395 million. So that was his suggestion at the time, based upon escalations that he felt should have been put into the project. He may change his mind today, given that in 2008 things have changed.
Radically. Thank you.
Mr. Dutton, then Mr. Nielsen, then Mr. Blumenfield, you're next, then Mr. Dutton.
Actually, 2 transportation-related minds think alike because we both deal with. I was thinking the exact same thing as I was listening of all these increased costs in the transportation world. We're seeing the costs come dramatically down 20%, and it just seemed real strange. I was going to ask the same question. So.
It's a good question. Mr. Dutton, then Mr. Nielsen, then Mr. Cheney.
With the, I couldn't resist. Maybe we should look at building it, bigger. So now we don't have to worry about, it being too small. But what I was concerned about was the. What I'm concerned about is the with this resolution is it just seems like it needs. I hear the logic behind what Senator Leno's been saying, and certainly that would be the common sense. You don't go forward until you know what the outcome is of legal challenges and so forth. But the trouble with the bill itself, or the language being submitted that we have with it, it just seems like it excessively ties our hands, though, and we find ourselves in that kind of a position so much, and and of the budget and everything we're dealing with. It just my area of concern is that the language just ties our hands too much. Not that I don't necessarily agree with it. I'm just concerned that it would lock it in, so we don't have any other way to go. So.
Mr. Nielsen.
Well, I certainly respect Senator Leno, and he has a manifest interest. He represents San Quentin, and that's a very difficult challenge to ever represent. This will always reintroduce the death penalty debate in California. And the provisions here that are offered, in effect, are another stay on the completion of any death sentence. It will be now a legislative impediment to any executions occurring in California beyond any legal ones. And I don't necessarily think it helps our legal case. The language says the department terms it can legally double cell. I mean, just the use of the word can has certain legal implications. It doesn't, I wouldn't necessarily assume that we have to double cell, in other words. But the can could be a legal impediment, not being an attorney, but just being around law. And it also calls for the resolution of federal court litigation. It doesn't say which litigation. There will always be litigation. One of my very good friends, Michael Lawrence, is the head of the California Appellate Project, and he and I disagree vehemently on the death penalty. He speaks every year at a seminar I conduct at San Quentin on the death penalty. He's great, but his passion in life is to stop this from ever happening. So litigation will always continue. And that does bother me, and then the EIR process too. That's just a further complication. In other words, there's a real impediment to any executions that are happening. This really strengthens the hand, I think, of some of the litigation to stop the death penalty, and therefore would oppose it.
All right, Mr. Cheney, and then we'll wrap up with Mr. Leno.
Well, I don't know. This whole thing has been hugely frustrating. The numbers on this, when it went from 220 to 300 and half the size, I mean, all of that part of this thing has been a nightmare from the get-go. The continuing complication about just making a decision one way or the other, and certainly I appreciate Marin's desire, not to close San Quentin, but the flip side, and has the department done any research to find any place else in the earth where you could put this death penalty chamber? I mean, we don't see that going forward either. Maybe it could be done for less cost someplace else if you could figure out how to get anybody in the state to take it in a different prison. But I don't, or take one of your ones that we hope to vacate, the DJJ Center or one of the women's prisons or something where we can move people to lower security facilities. But you're going to have to come up with a plan, which is, I think, what we said every year since I can remember, since 900, is we need a plan for what we're doing. And it has to include the health beds and the dental and the mental health issues. It's got to include what you're doing with this, because we've known it's out of compliance for wherever. And we've got all these different courts on us, which we've got to figure out how to undo. And so it's just, I don't know, it's just the most hugely frustrating, process, and everybody's right. I don't know how we're getting these weird construction bids that are making this thing escalate so much. I don't know what's in it that makes this so costly for so few beds.
And this is the project authority. When we go out to bid, this was done previously. When we go out to bid, it may be that the bids come in lower than the authorized project scope and cost.
But what made the scope and cost go up by a third for a third less beds?
There were a variety of factors. There were some site-specific factors having to do with the ground at San Quentin. There was an escalation of the cost of concrete and steel.
That was then. This is now. Yeah, okay.
But the authorization is based on a cost estimate that was done almost 2 years ago now. So
yeah, exactly.
Obviously the world has changed, and if and when the project goes to bid, we'll see what the real costs of the project are.
And has there been any thought at all to whether the death penalty place should be moved from the oldest prison in the state, other than the San Francisco lawyers who don't like it being moved?
There has been a lot of work and discussion on that issue, and I think in the context of the sale of San Quentin, it's work that we're also looking at again. There's other sites that were explored in the past and that we're looking at again.
Elio had a response.
If you take a look at the, and we are looking at that, and with some help from CDCR and some of the gentlemen that do most of these conceptual estimates, we're looking at the cost of in-place concrete and in-place steel. If you look at just the cost of concrete and steel, which they say is not appropriate, you're in and of itself, you're looking at only a 35 to 40% increase in those costs since 2002, when we built our last prison at Kern Valley, and when in fact this particular prison was probably undergoing its conceptual estimates to prepare for the 2003-2004 budget. So those are not the drivers, but there are other drivers that drive up cost. And this is what we're trying to get our arms around right now, and this relates directly to AB 900, and this relates directly to this project. This project does not stand alone, nor is it unique. It is part of this overall concern about the rising cost of construction for our prison facilities. But there are other factors. And we want to be able to take a look at those factors. There's something called market conditions, and there's something called the bubble of 2005 and 2006. But again, just at a very top level, looking at some of the projects that these gentlemen pointed out to me, the gentlemen from Kitchell that do these conceptual estimates, we looked at some projects that may have doubled in cost, but not, for example, quadrupled a cost, and not in the case last year when I looked at San Quentin, not tripled in cost. So there are some other factors here that are driving up those particular base cost of construction, and we have not gotten our arms around those yet.
Okay. Mr. Leno, and then I'd like to take a vote on your motion.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate the time you've afforded this issue. I will conclude. I just want to clear the air on some of the direction of this conversation. Mr. Nielsen, in particular, this really has absolutely nothing to do with one's opinion on the death penalty. I'm trying to make a fiscally conservative argument here that before we spend upwards of now, the last number we heard was $395 million, we're pushing $500 million of expenditure, and we don't know whether we can constitutionally double bunk death row inmates. This is yet to be determined. It is a serious question. And I want to ask LAO one last question. So 700 beds, we have about 660 death row inmates right now?
As of yesterday, actually at death row right now, and not at CMF in the mental health crisis beds, by the way, we have 633 gentlemen.
Okay, very good. So the point I'm trying to reach here is that if we were at some point told, after having spent $400 million, we cannot double bunk, how do we manage a population that we're expecting to see grow well over 700 million by the time this project is done, in 700 inmates in death row, in how many cells? Because 700 beds in, we would be beyond capacity.
We're going to max out. The recommendation that the BSA consultant made was that we need yet to build another stacked facility, a fourth stack. These are all going to be stacked. This is the first time, to my knowledge, and maybe I need to be corrected, that we've ever stacked 180s. So you're basically going to have 4 stories. You're going to have the mezzanine level. So they're going to be stacked on top of one another in order to conserve space. And so we would have, if we would build a fourth one there at an increased cost, but there'd be some scales of economy, you could accommodate, obviously, 1,024 versus 68. So you build another stacked one. That was one of his recommendations, but obviously at an increased cost.
But just to put a note on it, we would be beyond capacity. We would not have enough beds if we could not double bunk them to manage our death row in population. So I would ask for your support of the language, and I just want the record to note that the senator from San Francisco is making the fiscally conservative and responsible argument.
So noted. All right, we have a motion. Members on the Senate side? 3 ayes, 2 noes. And on the Assembly side, 2 noes and 2 ayes with Mr. Mr. De Leon absent for the moment, and he'll add on. All right. The next item is page 19. It's our last item in public safety. And after we conclude with this item, we will be breaking for briefing on the remaining agenda items so that we can finish up our work this afternoon. This is an LAO proposal to redirect local public safety funding. The 0.15% vehicle license fee that was included in the February budget for a savings of $250 million. So, LAO, would you like to open on this, please?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just by way of background, this is we're talking about 0.15% of that VLF shift that is used for these public safety programs that is set to expire at the end of the 2010-11 budget year. Now, we're talking about 15 programs that support local public safety. Most of these programs were created at a time when the state was in a much better fiscal situation, and they were designed to provide supplemental funds. In total, all of these programs provide about roughly 1% of the local public safety spending. And given the state's fiscal situation this year, the legislator may want to consider redirecting some or all of these funds back to the general fund. Now, the specific proposal you have in front of you here is to redirect $250 million out of that $500 million to the general fund, which would achieve the $250 million in savings in 2009-10, as well as $250 million in 2010-11. The programs that we've included here are juvenile justice related grant programs. This is not the only way to do this. There could be an across-the-board cut also of 50% to all of these programs. We've included these programs because we looked at them over the years, and they have shown that they do reduce juvenile arrests, juvenile incarceration, and they are effective programs, and they have reporting requirements that show that, in contrast to many of the other programs that we're talking about here.
Thank you. Did the Department of Finance have a response?
We don't support the LAO proposal. We think these revenues were raised for a particular purpose, and they need to remain for that purpose, particularly in light of the rest of the reductions and the other packages that we're looking at in corrections and in other areas.
Okay. I actually have a question and then a statement regarding my opinion on this issue. The question is, will federal stimulus funds be coming in that can be used for any of these programs?
Federal stimulus funds generally cannot be used to supplant state reductions, and it's part of a function of what other things are done with those funds. There's a number of different items under discussion about where to direct some of the burn JAG funds, and depending on what they're used for, then they're not available for other purposes.
Well, that I understand,
the activities, some of the activities could be consistent with what some of those federal funds could be used for, okay. But generally they do have non-supplantation requirements.
Does the LAO agree with that?
Well, there will be considerable increases in the burn funds, for example. From last year to this year, there's an increase in the direct local assistance in the ongoing drag funds from $5.6 to $21 million. In addition to that, there's also going to be an increase in the stimulus funds that go directly to the counties. That will be the counties will get $90 million. And it's my understanding if there's an across-the-board cut, to public safety because of the state's fiscal situation, that it would not necessarily be in violation of the supplantation clause.
Okay, so there is potentially some room to work in there.
I believe so, yes.
The comment I wanted to make is that I was really supportive of what we did in the February budget, and I think it benefited local law enforcement at a time when they are facing increasing challenges, and many of those challenges being in the mental health area, because locally we're not doing the kinds of things we need to do to shift people out of the criminal justice system and into the mental health care system. But as I say, I was very supportive of it. When I initially looked at this, I wasn't necessarily supportive of adopting the LAO proposal, but I do very much want to leave this issue open because, there are other issues that we're dealing with here, including funding of sheriffs in the judicial system. And so it's all, to me, part of the same discussion that needs to happen. So I am going to recommend, and the recommendation is anyway, that we would hold this open. Ms. Ducheney and then Mr. Nielsen.
Well, I mean, I understand that in February we did this for that reason, but that was before the $6 billion that were also part of that deal were lost in the May election. And that was also when that original thing was struck before folks removed $1 billion worth of gas excise tax increase. So I don't know that those sort of agreements that related to a different time and space are relevant today, because the other things that weren't going to happen from that same agreement, partly because of these sorts of pieces, were that CalWORKS and IHSS and some of those folks were not going to be hit the way that people are now proposing to hit them. So, we weren't going to take the SSI grants below, more than 93% of poverty, and now we want to go to 92% of poverty. I mean, we just got to get over that. So I appreciate the LAO bringing this forward. And I have concerns about some of the, I'm trying to remember all the programs that are in here, because here they're only partially listed. But from my recollection, it would be rural sheriffs. I mean, we may need that list, because I agree with the chair. We're going to have to keep this open. To me, not only is it part of that discussion with the sheriffs and folks, it's also part of a local government discussion that we'll get to later this afternoon. But we cannot continue to both have the property tax shift that was caused by the VLF cut, the 1A, the Prop 42 sequestering, all of those things, and continue to do what I consider most, in this case, subventions. This COPS program was created to deal with ERAF shifts back in the 90s, and was a one-time program once upon a time about 10 years ago. And when all of the other things around it changed, and we reduced the VLF, and we gave the counties and cities property tax and all of that, we continued nonetheless to fund the COPS program, which is a minimal amount of money for individual law enforcement agencies, and goes to this whole problem of actually trying to unwind this business of who pays for what where. Local cops are local cops. You get property tax. You get your local sales tax. And yeah, we know that you're hurting too, so we should try not to take more of that base funding from you. But on the flip side, you cannot have all of the local subventions at the same time. And we are going to have to cope with that. And my favorite, one of those unwindy things that when we come back to this, is inside this item, which is the booking fees. You can't continue to let counties charge booking fees to cities and have the state paying the cities to pay the county for the booking fees. It's just not rational. And it's, it's a small amount of money in one ways, but it is enough to prevent us from closing parks, for instance. And we've got to try to figure out what the state's obligation is to pay for these crazy prison things that we just talked about, to pay for our own state parks is our responsibility, and it's not, for better or worse, we got to try not to raid them and make things worse for local government, but we also can't continue to pay for what is their responsibility at the same time we're doing that. And, we've done it for years. These programs are all great, rural sheriffs, and, and the juvenile one is a little tricky because both are they effective. But, we're shifting responsibilities. We've shifted a lot of funds for juvenile programs in the last few years because of the trying to take down DJJ. So, how we think about this, and maybe it's partial. I mean, I understand you can't just take everybody off of everything at one time, but we've got to get real here about what these things are, and particularly the camps and probation. That one's been around since before all of that other madness. We used to use it as TANF MOE. We don't do that anymore, somebody told me yesterday. So the state's participation in that then becomes, it's a larger, to me, this is part of a kind of a realignment. I don't know that we're prepared to realign everything, but a kind of a discussion. We've got to figure out what part of the juvenile program and the corrections and given all the parole reform, that law enforcement is going to have some impacts from that, and they need resources for those things. But separating the county things, which part of the Health and Human Services, all of these are impacts to the same group of folks over and over again, cities and counties. And we are going to have to take all of those things together and figure out where that reduction is. And it seems to me it's simpler to do reductions in things that are subventions and are not with the part where we're taking their money. So,
Mr. Nielsen, then Mr. Dutton.
I must say I really appreciate Senator Cheney's institutional memory and knowledge. She brings that out in these proceedings. It's very helpful in context. And what she's talking about does get us to current resolution, so I appreciate you having that memory. And I have my own. And this particular area, it's about keeping good faith to local government. I've always argued that local government was a stepchild of government in California, and to most degree, particularly the counties. And just recently, there was a good faith gesture to them in this particular regard, attaching this to the VLF. And I was very much in sympathy, and I remain very much in sympathy. And I think we should keep the faith in this area. If we establish that public safety and helping citizens who are on the wrong track in life, as in with the juvenile justice and the interventions, is important, then we need to get up to the plate and stick with it. And not do things that aggrieve the counties, that compromise their ability to do such things as public safety and protecting the people in our community. So I certainly am in sympathy with leaving the item open, but I would not be in sympathy, I don't think, ultimately on the vote to disconnect this. I think this is something keeping in good faith, particularly in view of the fact that pursuant to some of these parole policies that I may oppose some of and maybe support some, are going to significantly impact our local law enforcement, police, and sheriffs. Very significantly, as well as our citizenry. So I think we need to protect this funding, and probably will opt to vote that way.
Madam Chair. Mr. Dutton and then Mr. Leno.
Yeah, and I'm glad you're getting over your shyness, Denise. I wish. She used to be such a withdrawn person and lack in emotion and so forth. I actually. I have a problem with this for a lot of different reasons, and it's not that I obviously didn't particularly care for the budget deal like most people did that was entered into last go around. Frankly, there were things that when I was working on the transportation bond and was one of the major players in that effort, there were things in that I didn't necessarily agree with, but there was an agreement that was reached by everybody, and this ties directly to that. And so I think that we'd be very like I said, even though I don't necessarily agree with everything, I think it would be really dangerous for us to start, changing things that was specifically understood and agreed to. So I, frankly, would make a motion to reject the LEO's proposal.
Okay, Mr. Leno.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's just curious to note that those among us who are talking and making reference and holding true to the agreement didn't vote for this 0.15% increase in the vehicle license fee, and it raises the procedural question as to whether the two-thirds of the legislature that voted for this money should be the ones who could vote to redirect this money, because many of you didn't vote for this money to begin with. So I just want to raise the question.
Simple solution. Let's just increase the VLF by the 0.15.
He voted for it.
Okay, members, we have a motion before us, which is to reject the LAO proposal. As I've told you, I'm sorry, Mr. Nielsen seconded it.
And Madam Chair, just
yes, Mr.
very briefly, Mr. Leno made a comment with regard to those directly apart or not apart. First of all, The budget was passed by the institution, and any member of the institution is free to make comments on that deal, whether they supported individual pieces of it or not. And as one who did support this particular piece, I didn't make any comments because Mr. Nielsen on my side of the institution extremely well articulated, and I don't believe in redundancy. But just to clarify, I am absolutely in support of the motion that's before us.
And to clarify my position, I would have been in support of that motion, but I simply cannot close this out until I can get some discussion and agreement and movement with the overall global issue relating to the courts and the funding of court security. And until I can get that resolved, I'm not willing to say that I am going to support that motion now or in the future. So we have a motion. I'll have to ask for the vote. On the Senate side, the motion to reject would be 3 against and 2 in favor. And on the Assembly side, it would be 2 in favor and 2 against, with Mr. De Leon being absent, and he will add on. All right, so members, that concludes our discussion of public safety. We have dealt with the vote only part of it. We will be recessing until 1:15, and it's my hope that we are going to be finishing our briefing on the remaining agenda items so that we can come back at 1:15 and conclude all of our first pass at the entire agenda that is before us. So we'll come back at 1:15, members. And I need the room to be cleared for staff to do reconciliation.